I think we can get going. I'm Ed Nersessian, the director of the center. Today's program on status was recommended to us and was organized by, I should say, by Anne-Marie Levine and Darian McMahon. And I'm going to let Anne-Marie introduce the participants. The associate director, Jerry Horowitz, would sit in at the meeting. Thank you.
Welcome. I guess we shouldn't have programs on beautiful June days. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and then I'll read bios. A recent New York Times article proclaimed status anxiety one of the defining preoccupations of our time. But what are we really anxious about? What, in fact, is status, and why do we want it? This Helix discussion will consider that complex question from a variety of different perspectives: historical, psychological, sociological, and biological. Together, we hope to generate insights about what it is that so many of us pursue and think we want. So when I read your bios, if you'd raise your hand, then people will know who you are. W. Warner Burke, PhD, is a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he has been since 1979. He teaches leadership and organization change and development. His research focuses on learning agility, multi-rater feedback, and leadership. He has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited 21 books and written over 200 articles and book chapters. He has received several Lifetime Achievement Awards and NASA's Public Service Medal. Too many for me to say here. It's on the website, though. James L. Fuller is a research fellow at Columbia University, where he recently completed his PhD. His doctoral research focused on the evolution and expansion of vocal signal repertoires, focusing primarily on the communication system of blue monkeys. Dr. Fuller began working with wild primates in Kenya in 1995 and has since participated in behavioral and conservation-directed research in Uganda, DR Congo, is that right? Okay. Thailand and Cambodia. In addition, he has been a guest lecturer on the evolution and usage of communication systems in birds and mammals, as well as the sensory systems of vertebrates. David Levine's work encompasses theater, performance, video, and photography. His performance and exhibition work have been presented by the Brooklyn Museum, Creative Time, MoMA, Red Cat, the MCA Chicago, Mass MoCA, PS 122, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and has been featured in Artforum, Frieze, Theater, Bomb, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. His solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, Some of the People, All of the Time, was named one of the 10 best exhibitions globally by The New York Times in 2018. He has also directed operas and plays at Brick House, the Atlantic Theater, Primary Stages, and Soho Rep. His essays in dramatic writing have been published in N+1, Theater, Cabinet, Parquet, and Triple Canopy. He is the recipient of a 2018 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2013 Obie Award, in addition to fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute, the MacDowell Colony, and the Foundation for Contemporary Art. Best Behavior, an anthology of his critical writings, will be published by the 53rd State Press in 2019. He is professor of the practice of performing, theater, and media at Harvard University. Darren McMahon is professor of history at Dartmouth College, educated at the University of California, Berkeley, and Yale, where he received his PhD in 1998. McMahon is the author of Enemies of the Enlightenment, Happiness, a History, which has been translated into 12 languages and was awarded Best Books of the Year honors by innumerable publications, and Divine Fury, A History of Genius. He has edited and co-edited many other books and has been a guest professor at many distinguished universities. He has received also major fellowships, many of them. McMahon is currently co-editor at the journal Modern Intellectual History and is at work now on a book about the history of ideas of equality, and is writing another about lighting and illumination in the Age of Enlightenment. Tairisha Poe had to cancel a couple of hours ago, which leads me to say that we did make an effort to try to make the panel more diverse in every way, as well as in terms of gender and ethnicity, but we're foiled by last-minute cancellations and conflicting schedules, etc. Okay, onward.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm going to go ahead and begin because this gathering is my fault, or at least my idea. Anne-Marie mentioned I've been working for the last couple of years on a book about equality, history of ideas of equality, and status relates to that, and I thought it might be fun to convene a group of people to talk about status in the way that we do at Helix, in a kind of unhurried way, moving toward wisdom. Status is a subject that touches on a whole number of different domains. There's a classic sociological literature on status. Max Weber and Thorstein Veblen and people like that in the 19th century thought a lot about it. But it touches deeply on psychology, on human biology and primatology, anthropology, as well as organizational development and marketing. So I thought, wow, this could make for a really rich discussion. We had the hardest time convening this group, and Anne-Marie's laughing. We've gone back and forth for months, and that's why you ended up with a group of white men of a certain age, and we tried otherwise, but this is what you get. But it was curious, and it led me to wonder why that's the case. And one thing I think is that status is a subject that touches on a lot of different fields, and yet there's not a professor of status at Columbia or a historian who studies status, and so people might have been a little bit uncomfortable going outside their areas of expertise. But I also think there's something about status and hierarchy that makes people uncomfortable. I think that in this age and in a nominally democratic society, whose founding ideal or founding myth, if you prefer, is equality, it makes us a little uncomfortable to talk about these things. In fact, there was a special issue of the journal Aeon a number of years ago that raised just this point, and a number of distinguished scholars sort of came to the conclusion that we've forgotten how to talk about hierarchy or status. And so I think it's actually a timely discussion. And despite whether or not we want to talk about it, we think about it all the time, whether consciously or not. The noted primatologist Franz de Waal has pointed out that below the radar of consciousness, we communicate status every time we talk with someone. Robert Sapolsky, equally noted biologist and primatologist, has pointed out that we are intensely interested in and adept at spotting rank difference in status. Our brains are incredibly good at and exquisitely attuned to detecting status, and all social primates do this. We note body size, we note eye contact, we note posture, and that's true of all social primates. And then human beings, in addition to that, are registering things like status, like perceived income, and other cues that give them insight into status. As the great anthropologist and social psychologist Alan Fiske has pointed out, what he calls authority ranking, making distinctions about perceived status, is one of the central ways that human beings interact. There are others, but that's one of the four, in his view, principal ways of interacting. And for most people in most times in human history, that wouldn't have been a surprise at all, because until relatively recently, broadly speaking, the long 18th century, inequality was the norm. And hierarchy was the way things were, both economic inequality, but social, political, and legal, meaning that status was a legal demarcation and a legal distinction. There were different types of human beings, or that was the line. Looking at the etymology of the word status is interesting in this respect, and I'll stop here just in a moment. The word status comes from the Latin. It's just a declension of the Latin verb stare, which means to stand or to remain in place. And some of the oldest uses in English of the word status are actually reflect this link to the word stature. So in 16th century English, you could speak about the status of trees, which just meant the height of trees. Or I found a line from the 17th century, the height of a man is status, which is interesting in a number of connections. But the word is also closely related to the word state or the word estate, right? As in a core or a particular rank of society. So the French talk about the third estate or the three estates. That prior to the end of the 18th century, again, legally demarcated one's status. You were a slave or a free person. You were a peasant or an artisan. And status then was a legal demarcation. Well, since the 18th century, beginning with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, we've moved away from that type of thinking about status towards what the philosopher Jeremy Waldron has called a single status society, in which we hold one another to all be equals by nature. And yet clearly status hasn't gone away. And if anything, I think it's become more confusing. And this, again, is reflected in the definition. So the only definition you'll find for status in a kind of quasi-modern way in the 18th century refers to this legality. So here's an 18th century definition from the OED: the fact or position of belonging to a group which is subject to certain legal rights or limitations. So it's the legal classification of a slave or of a child or what have you. In the 19th century, in the early 19th century, that moves to being the rank, position, or standing of a thing, especially with regard to its importance. Okay? But it's no longer clear who determines that importance. And I think that's part of the murkiness, but all the interest of status as we think about it moving forward from the 19th century. So with that, and the perfect timing of the music, let me open it up to the group to come in, and we'll follow the conversation where it leads. Or I'll just keep talking.
I have only a couple of thoughts about status. I pronounce it status, not status. I don't know what the hell you're from there. In any case, we do not own status. We get status from other people.
Yeah.
So we have to really bear that in mind. I don't determine whether I have status or not. I can do it to some extent, but it's others that are going to declare it in my case, in everybody's case. So that's important to not lose sight of. I don't have that much control over it in many respects. It's whether or not other people think I have status. The other thought is that we desire status. I think most all of us do, especially us in academia, that's for sure. And then when we get it, it's sort of different than what we expected. Just a very quick story. I have a colleague. She is the last one of our particular group to not be a full professor. So this past year, she went up for full professor and made it unanimously and not a problem whatsoever, and everybody supported it and so on and so forth. Afterwards, I've never seen anybody more depressed. And she's still, I think to this day, not quite over it. But over it in this particular case means feeling really down. Then I discovered recently that psychologists call something like that arrival fallacy. And that once we get there, it's not what we thought. And that's what she has said to me more than once. It's just not quite what I thought it would be. And so that arrival fallacy means, in the broader sense, now psychologists speaking, we don't do very well about predicting the future, none of us. In fact, there's something called a planning fallacy. Can you do this by August the 1st? Of course I can. And August the 1st comes up and I have gotten nowhere, with it. I make that mistake all the time. But I'm not unique. Many of us, if not most of us, do that. So we're not very good at figuring out what's going to happen. We think we know what's going to happen, but when it happens, it rarely is the way we thought it was going to be. And that is particularly true, apparently, about achieving something that we desperately want, and then when we get it, it's just not quite what I thought it was going to be. Now, if you tell her I've told this story, your life will be in danger. So,
I'm pretty sure it's being simulcast. So.
But you didn't mention any names.
I didn't mention any names.
It's interesting, as you were saying that, as both of you were speaking, I kept thinking, well, one of the challenges of this topic in general is the problem with the definition. And what occurs to me is that there's very different uses or perspectives on the same concept, and it's relative to the environment or the context in which we're discussing it. So I think at the most basic level, one can say that one's status could describe one's condition or position, and therefore, by definition, it's relative to something else, relative to another individual, relative to some temporal component or something like that. And so what that suggests to me, as this is not my field at all, I can speak at length about it. I can say whatever I want.
Yes.
But what occurs to me is that what one might start by doing is delineating different uses of the term or to describe different things. And I think that in our society, in human society, and I would imagine of greater interest to this assemblage, is social status and what that means. And I would say that we need a predictive framework. As you said, we don't know what to expect when we get there and things like that. But I think why we find status and a deference to position throughout cultures and throughout societies and to some degree across species is because we need a predictive framework to operate within our social structures. If I don't know what to expect from you behaviorally, and you don't know what to expect from me behaviorally, it's going to make for a very challenging social interaction. And status and a recognition and deference to that status. So one might say that, socially speaking, status is really an agreement. There's an agreement that if your status confers upon you certain responsibilities and access to resources, you get that, and I agree to let you have that, and vice versa. So I think the greater issue then comes from how that status is acquired. And I think we see in our society, and presumably across societies and across history. I don't study humans. I find humans very odd and very confusing. And
what if you were a psychologist?
Oh, God, this is awful. But congratulations to all of you. Anyway, I think that we have positions of status that carry with them a certain degree of responsibilities and access to resources and permissions that are intrinsic. So one might say that I assume I didn't measure everyone, but my status as tallest person in this round table is unimpeachable, and it's simply an intrinsic fact. Yeah, well, it's starting to change rapidly, right? And it's irrelevant, and so only if that position matters to anyone or has some relevance to some social context should we start paying attention to it. But there are intrinsic characteristics that simply are part of the individual. And then I would say on the polar opposite side of that would be the arbitrarily assigned status ranks, so royalty. People become monarchs with, to some degree, absolute power through absolutely nothing than the fortune of their birth. And then there's that middle ground of talking about reaching the rank of full professor, which is earned by merit, yet merit alone isn't sufficient. It also requires some external judgment to confer that. So I think I've sort of lost the thread already. I was hoping someone would interrupt me. But I think where we go with that is that, to me, social status within modern human culture is only as strong as the degree to which we agree to abide by it.
That's right.
If the person who is in charge is only in charge because people agree to listen to that person, if we all stop listening to that person stops being in charge. And so it really speaks to the question of how status is achieved or acquired, as well as how is it maintained and enforced.
James, I hate to tell you this, but as you age, you're going to get shorter.
I'm aging. That's good. I'll look forward to those days.
Which means, though, that how we confer status is a real measure of our own scale of values, right? So what we take to be... I mean, one of the things that came out, David, I don't know if you want to come in, but I think this is important, is that there's a distinction, a sharp one sometimes and less sharp at others, to be drawn between status and power, or status and wealth. And Weber, whom I mentioned before, his classic sort of tripartite discussion of stratification in society distinguishes between class, based on wealth, and power, by which he meant political or military power, actual ability to do things, and then status, or Stand he called it, which is something like prestige. And he saw those as distinct. Now, I think there's clearly overlap, but there are ways in which, in various economies or regimes, status and wealth, or status and power, have nothing to do with one another. Again, we go back to academia, right? One can have great status in academia and be poor and have no power whatsoever. And in fact, it often works that way.
It often works.
Or one can have great power and great wealth and have very low status. I think of a particular example. He comes to mind. I won't mention him here, but one can imagine that case too. Have wealth and power, but have social judgment that's largely negative.
It's interesting when Darren, you mentioned earlier how there was this movement to have a sort of a one status principle since our revolution and the French Revolution, and so I have this image of things. There being an attempt to equalize everything, to quiet things down and make everyone on a level, and then the system runs forward and it emerges again. So I guess I'd like to know, what causes that? What is that? What are the factors that influence the reemergence of a hierarchy, let's say, that involves status?
I have things to say about that, but others do too, I'm sure.
Well, there's a biological component. I would think someone here might.
Nothing in biology makes sense. I would say when we find characteristics that appear to be universal and difficult to control through modern human social constructs, it suggests that there must be some underlying biological drive in that direction. And I think one of the things, I think if we say the word status one more time, it will lose all meaning. And it had little meaning to me when we walked in here, and now it's completely gone out the window.
But that's good.
And to me, and also because I think of status as a very objective, measurable, defined as condition or state. The state of things. And therefore, when we talk about equality, I don't think equality and absence of status are connected with one another. Rank or hierarchy is perhaps the better way of thinking about it. But I know that just linguistically we tend to conflate things. But so in non-human primates, there is, almost across species, there is often seen some type of ranking. And that ranking is ordered by researchers. We observe things. So we are trying to make sense of an observed pattern. So the fact that one might recognize the alpha male of a group of chimpanzees by his behavior and by the behavior that is shown towards him and by his access to mates and his access to food resources. That doesn't suggest that he has some sort of conferred upon him status or rank. It's our way of measuring and describing a pattern. Whereas in human society, if you were to grant me a rank right now, I would be no different than I was a minute ago, but suddenly I would have power, influence, access to resources that I didn't have, and yet I would not be any different. So I think that one of the biggest differences that we see in humans and non-humans is that the ranking, the hierarchy, and the differential access to resources that we see in non-humans tends to be associated with some measurable attribute. Physical strength, ability to form coalitions, to some degree, some cognitive ability or cleverness and things like that. But those are attributes that are relevant to that position. Whereas we have seen monarchs throughout the ages who have zero physical or cognitive capabilities that suggest they are better positioned to be in that position, and yet they have been conferred upon it. So I think, again, lost the thread, sorry. But I do think that what you were suggesting is that I think we have a built-in, hardwired, genetically predisposed hunger for hierarchy, hunger for recognition of rank differences that allow us to have a predictive framework so that we can interact. And as we socially move forward and say, no, we should all be equal, we shouldn't have status, yet that hunger allows us or keeps driving us to say, I see differences, let's rank those differences, as opposed to say, you're different, we're different, but we are not ranked in any sort of hierarchical or ordinal way.
And we can use any variety of criteria to establish those differences. And of course, every society does, right? In ancient Mayan, the nobility had flat heads, so having a less oval head was a sign of status. I love to point out, as somebody who loves books, that in the early modern period, books were very expensive, and so books were a sign of prestige. You had libraries the way that people now have art collections to confer wealth and status. So the criteria by which we make these distinctions change, and it changes, I think, quite dramatically in the 18th century, where those distinctions go from being based upon quote-unquote blood to ostensibly at least being based on merit, which becomes a new kind of standard to draw hierarchies, although there are obviously all kinds of problems with that. I wanted to go back to something you said, James, and just to ask, because where you went towards the end there about the kind of genetic predisposition, I mean, it's clearly not irrelevant that we share, 98.5% of our DNA with bonobos and chimpanzees, which both, bonobos less so, are intensely hierarchical creatures. And I think that that's something that we just need to kind of take in. But you said something to the effect that a status hierarchy among chimpanzees and the identification of an alpha male doesn't confer status or status, and I suppose it depends what we mean, but it certainly confers access to resources, right? And on some level, that's what status is.
Right. Exactly, and I think it gets circular and semantic to the point of becoming very uninteresting. But to me, in a very simplified way, I think a big distinction is the directionality. When I look at a group of, let's say, blue monkeys, because that's a species that I study carefully.
What you do a lot.
When I look at a group of blue monkeys, I don't decide who's in charge and then confer upon them access to resources and access to food.
But the group does, right? The group of blue monkeys does.
It exists. This is the great thing about being a very objective scientist. You can always say, I have no judgment, I have no evaluation, or so no kind of value judgment, simply observing patterns. The pattern is that this animal has right of access to food prior to the others. This animal is given more deferential grooming, things like that. And so we recognize behavior, and from that behavior, we organize things into some sort of ranked position. Whereas I think in human society, it might go the opposite direction, which is that one might be interacting quite equally with one another, and as soon as I mention the fact that I actually am the Crown Prince of Monaco, behavior will change. So it has nothing to do with how the behaviors sort of naturally play out and how one acts in a certain way, in that the arbitrary and to some degree externally assigned rank or status changes behavior. Whereas I think when we look at non-human species, we don't actually know what's going on, despite the fact that everyone who writes things says we know what's going on. What we can say is the patterns observed appear to function this way, which is that there appears to be a hierarchy. There appears that some animals enjoy a greater access to resources, greater access to mates. Some animals receive more aggression, other animals don't, things like that. And so that suggests that this hierarchy exists. The question is, how is it achieved? How is it assigned? How does it come about? Whereas And so that's, I would say that the biggest difference is that there's a directionality there in that.
Well, you wouldn't expect to find an arrival fallacy among blue monkeys.
I wouldn't look for it, but yeah.
Sounds like much more of a human sort of response to whatever is causing this hierarchy to develop. Right? Monkeys might not have that sort of response. I mean, maybe they could, but it would be interesting to figure that sort of thing out. I would guess it's mostly a human thing, that we can respond to an announcement. You've just become the Crown Prince of Monaco, so we're all going to bow to you now. No, I mean, that's a difference between that and monkeys, right?
Probably.
I mean, I'm curious. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but as is there you go, the monkey hole, right? But I mean,
different thing.
Jane Goodall, Christopher Boehm, Franz de Waals would all argue that there's a kind of self-conscious politics in the group of higher primates, right? So that status is on some level conferred, and alliances are formed and whatnot. I'm sensing you're skeptical to that, but that's fine. But
I'm always skeptical of attributing human cognitive patterns to. I'm actually skeptical of attributing it to other humans. I can barely figure out how I think. I let alone certainly don't want to assume how others think. But I'm very supportive of people whose work suggests certain types of thought processes. But to me, the behavioral patterns alone are sufficient to understand some sort of evolutionary trajectory. I think that at the end of the day, as humans, we very much we put so much emphasis on our intellect and so much emphasis on our cognitive abilities to plan and to plan 17 steps ahead, that we make assumptions that anything that has occurred must be the result of that sort of directed. I would like to be full professor, so I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to kiss up to my chair, and then I'm going to publish that. We have these things. So when we see patterns in non-humans, the formation of coalitions, and the more grooming to higher ranking individuals, there's this assumption that it must be on some level through a conscious understanding that if I groom you more often, you will be more likely to support me in an alliance later when we overthrow the alpha male and all of those other things. And it might be working that way, but to me, whether there is a conscious awareness or not, that pattern seems to be existing. There's some mechanism for maintaining it. I would bet, but I don't know, I would bet that mechanism for maintaining those hierarchies is much less complicated than it is in human society.
No question.
And I would bet that the mechanisms that maintain those ranks are much more related to physicality. Not necessarily just physical strength, although that's a huge part of it, but physicality in terms of access to food, access to breeding grounds, access to sleeping grounds, all of the things that matter. And we live in a society, you talked about a lot of things that to me are less about status or rank as much as they are about symbols of that. In that we have, you talked
Status
about
symbols.
You talked about things that by definition were very familiar to perhaps everyone in this room. Books. There are huge groups of people for whom books are not only not a symbol of high status, they're a symbol of wasted efforts and
they're
time.
not anymore. But I was talking about an earlier period in human history, right?
But that
yeah.
period of human history was also a relatively narrow part of global human culture. There were times and places in which, at the same time period within the 18th and 19th century, in which large groups of highly complex civilized societies did not place the same value on intellect or religion or money or food. All of these things.
A warrior
get moved around.
society would
Right.
honor people who have scars,
Right.
who
And
attain them in battle, right?
Right. So
yeah.
I think to kind of get to your point, which is that my sense is that if we see the same structural attempts to identify, acknowledge, maintain, and obey this ranking hierarchical system so that we can have a predictive framework, that suggests it's more or less universal, or it's somehow hardwired into our DNA or how we interact. I think then all that really changes is that, this year it was shoes, last year it was iPods, and next year it'll be something else. But at the end of the day, it's the structure is the same. We're just finding very different ways of doing it.
There are people in the audience dying to ask questions, but they're going to have to hold off for a little bit longer, and then we'll come in. I mean, James and I could go back and forth all day. I don't want to monopolize if other people want to come in the conversation. Dave?
But humans are the species that make status reads constantly, and especially like humans in cities, right? So part of it's also and I'm more interested in. I believe more in the attribution of status than I do in actual status. But I think that one thing you're suggesting is also that these like groups of like chimpanzees, they live in like clans or groups, and that's so status attributions remain relatively stable throughout the lifetime of a particular group, right? But basically what it makes me, I pretty much agree with you that it doesn't make any sense to ascribe our motivations or our patterns, it doesn't make any sense to ascribe human impulses at all to anything but human, if even humans. But I think also I would wonder, if you're a city dweller, you're reading situations like constantly, like from the moment you step out the door to the moment you get home, you're forced to make a million different reads, and I wonder if it makes sense to think about status or the activity of attributing status, relative to symbols and all these kind of other things that you encounter, like whether, like say, in a small town, like in a small, in a Balzac kind of town, like, how static would status attributions have been in like an 18th century village, in France, and would that have been based off a simpler set of attributes?
Right. And of course, these things can overlap, right? So, examples used of a janitor working in a large corporation, on some measure, low status position, but that same janitor might be the captain of the softball team, who in that realm has very high status, and of course these things can overlap at every measure, and which goes to James' point that when you scale up to human societies, these things become tremendously more complex because they're not just about resource acquisition, which with primates is essentially the end of the story, right? Where we want all kinds of things. In addition to that, right? Maybe. Including, well, I think so. We want recognition, right? We want admiration. I mean, I think this is, on some level, a basic human drive. And, you know, I'm an 18th century scholar, and so I'm always going back to my 18th century thinkers, and one of my favorite is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau says that we have this propensity for what he calls amour propre, for self-love that gets activated in certain situations. And it really is the desire for recognition, but that desire gets translated very quickly in not just the desire for recognition, but the desire to put down others. So that our own desire to be recognized, and if we think about this in a meritocracy, it becomes very interesting, becomes then at the same time desire to put down others. And so a competitive society in some ways are, you know, composed of people searching for recognition, but at the same time creating losers and lesser thans in the process, and that gets really complicated and problematic, right?
Yeah, and I would say that I don't disagree that in human culture and human society we want lots of things that don't relate directly to things like food and shelter and reproduction. I would argue that, or I would at least posit that the idea that it's universal suggests some biological underpinning, and the biological underpinning would have to be built, and not to keep reducing everything to sex and food, but that's how evolution works. You know, and so having the shiny object doesn't help you unless having that shiny object increases your probability of reproducing or having food long enough to survive so that you can reproduce. So I would say that the things that we do in our modern society, we have poetry and art and fast cars and monstrosity large buildings and all of these things. On some level, I think that the drive towards those things is related to the drive towards access to resources. And so I think, to get to your point about why is it that we constantly are seeking positive feedback from others, why do we want to be loved so much? If we want to reduce that to some biologically explainable relevance, that it would relate to alliance formation, coalition formation, and that sociality is odd. We think of sociality as normal because as humans we're social, and we look around at the animals that we think are interesting, and they happen to be social. But if you look across the animal kingdom, it's actually a quite rare occurrence, and it's very challenging to maintain, because hanging out with a bunch of other animals that are doing the exact same thing you are and want the same stuff you do is going to create all sorts of opportunities for aggression and competition, disease transfer, and horrible things going wrong. So to me, I think sociality is a mechanism for allowing us to stay together. And so things like a acknowledgement or recognition of hierarchical preferences and status and things like that is not so much of interest in and of itself as much as it's a tool, because without it we would all just be stabbing each other in the face, and we wouldn't get any of the benefits of social living.
I'm sorry. I was going to say there's this implication that humans have sort of taken it to a new level. And even as sort of David just mentioned, there seems to perhaps even be a difference between, you know, rural, not city dweller type individuals where their status and a number of signs that they take to indicate status may be a little bit simpler, or maybe I just don't know what it's like to live there. But it seems to me it's a compelling way to describe things, whereas now in our sort of urban setting, there are this myriad different signals you might get that might confer status, and it can actually be confusing.
I'm thinking of the classic essay by Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. And he's an anthropologist in Bali observing a cockfight, which is a major social event. And he likens it to the complexity of watching a Shakespeare play. And the reads that people are making, just like David's referring on the streets of Brooklyn, where you're suddenly, calculating this, that, or the other, probably going back to resource acquisition, sex, certainly, on the streets, right, are as complicated in that setting as they are on the streets of New York. Now, I mean, that's neither here nor there, but it is interesting. And again, I think it's this human penchant capacity to constantly judge status, which I should say is not only just about, I think, we're tending to think of the kind of negative side, but there's a way in which status is conferred frequently for social reasons, for positive benefits, right? So you think of I was just reading actually a wonderful book, shout out to Dr. Keltner's The Power Paradox, who's in psychology at Berkeley. And he has a little section on status, and he starts with a discussion of Inuit peoples who share food, share seals. And great status is conferred upon seal hunters who bring more food to the group, right? Status is conferred on professors who have, 50-odd PhD students and act selflessly throughout their careers for the help of others. Status is conferred on people who give large amounts of time and resources to the Met or what have you. And so status is that positive social conferral that grants us, as you say, privilege and access, but also does things to sort of support values that reaffirm the benefit of the group. We like to have these kind of high status individuals because they help us, right?
Let me remind us too that I got to speak for psychology, for heaven's sake. That in our introductory course in psychology, we were taught that Maslow said that ego status is a fundamental need, and that we do have the need for status. That we do have the need for assuaging our ego and so forth, and it's a basic fundamental need. It's a hierarchical one, he said, which, by the way, evidence does not support, but never mind about that. Evidence does support that we do have ego status kind of needs, fundamental.
Is that a cause of the development of hierarchies, or is that a consequence?
Ask Abraham, except he's gone now.
Psychologists can never answer those kind of questions, as you know. It's correlated.
Well, it's interesting because if you take this notion that you cannot draw clear-cut conclusions about this from animal studies, you don't know exactly, well, what are the progenitors of our drive to status? It leaves open the question because we don't think of monkeys whatsoever, it seems to me, as wanting to be told they're fantastic. Right, that's not an issue. Whereas you just finished saying, and I agree with you, humans love to hear that. So the question is, well, is that just our version of grooming?
Right.
Which I think what Robin Dunbar sort of promotes that idea, right? It's an extension of grooming behavior. Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't know.
The first thing that pops to mind as an analogy is that sugar. From an evolutionary perspective, sugar is killing humans right now. It's going to be the death of a massive portion of our population. It is a biologically driven desire, and that biologically driven desire has very simple to recognize evolutionary history. That having a sweet tooth, having a desire and a positive feedback from eating sweets is a great way to survive. If you're in the woods and you desire fruit more than others, you're going to go after fruit. You're going to get that rapid carbohydrate rush. You're going to get large amounts of energy. You're going to survive longer, breed more, pass that on to your offspring. So the idea that the desire for sugar, the fact that sugar is a pleasant thing for humans, is not good or bad. It just makes sense. The fact that current technology and social structure and access to resources has made it such that biological underpinning is being used to great detriment to all of us as a society, I think those can be looked at separately and as a related consequence. So one might suggest that this biological drive for a predictive framework, if we're going to be interacting with individuals regularly, there has to be some system for organizing us. Who's in charge? Who's not in charge? How do we get to be in charge? All of those things allows us to get through the day without completely falling apart. That basic biological underpinning sets the stage then for all sorts of horrible abuse. But but I don't think that those two are in conflict with one another. Just because humans are doing odd things with it doesn't mean that it's still not based on the same evolutionary foundation that we see in other species. And I happened to this morning look at a talk you gave on false crowds along those lines. And what occurred to me in that was that how one achieves status is seen, if you look at some non-human primate examples, some status, especially in female-oriented species, their status tends to be matrilineal. It's inherited. So it's irrelevant whether you're limping and funny-looking. If your mother was high-ranking, you might be high-ranking. But in many cases, especially in multi-male species, the ranking of the male depends on how well you form a coalition, as well as how strong you are. So you might be very strong, but there's nothing you can do against 7. So a coalition of 7 is better than being strong. So the ability to convince others that you matter, and that's the thing at the end of the day. It's not even saying that I have these attributes, I have these capacities, I have these skills that I will provide for all of you. If I convince you to say I'm interesting, that might suggest to these other people that I might be interesting. And suddenly, by the end of the day, everyone thinks I'm interesting, regardless of the fact that I'm completely dull. And so I think that the notion of why false crowds exist and why people who are popular tend to get more popular. You know, like, oh, that movie did really well this weekend, let's go see it next weekend. You know, there's this kind of this appeal of coalitions, and I think the manipulation of that is what we see in modern human society, that is a use of some underpinning and some underlying biological reality.
Explain false crowds.
Oh, it's pretty tangential to the, I mean, I see what you're saying. It's just, like hired protesters or hired ralliers or hired entourages or, hired
Political supporters.
hired political supporters, paying, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it reminds me, this very pregnant topic of populism, which is somewhat of a rebellion against the elite. And I have to say, I have to relate, you may have all seen this, but you mentioned earlier, Darren, that people can notice the way people walk and their stature and their behavior, but there was what I consider it's absolutely hysterical brief video of our president in England with the guards with the big furry hats. It's like a Charlie Chaplin shot. I mean, or it looks like a monkey looking under, like his behavior was so discordant with what you'd expect the president of a major country would be doing, because he just seemed to be interacting in a very different way. Interesting that gives many of us a reason to be, it went out, sorry, thank you. It gives many of us a reason to be sort of disparaging of him. I think that's well deserved, but for others it's a signal that we want to rally around him because he's the kind of guy that I know and like.
I thought James said something really interesting about sugar and a kind of whole food industry that exploits that underlying basic kind of genetic or evolutionary drive. The same, of course, is true with social media, which is very much like the grooming. The likes that you get on Twitter or Facebook give you that dopamine rush that sugar does. And that points to the fact that, there are a lot of very clever people in our society who think about status more than we do. And they think about all the signaling that goes on, and they think about how to signal it, right? And in some ways, tap into or draw on, or one might, in a harsher tone, say exploit, that capacity that we have to make these fine-grained distinctions all the time. I mean, in some ways, that's what drives marketing, right? I have a friend who markets drinks, sports drinks, and he's very clever, and I never knew that the marketing of sports drinks was so interesting. We had a conversation, but he told me something that for people in the industry is second nature, that, you know, when you market today now, you don't market a product, you market a lifestyle. And the lifestyle is all about status signaling, clearly. Yeah.
But I think what I find kind of exquisite about people, right, is that or exquisite about how we do status, is that you can't, you can't be seen to be too thirsty for it, right? So but it's weird, but that idea that, so if you're trying to get a lot of people to like you, or if you're trying to, within the arts, it would be poor form. It would be poor form to advocate it's okay if you advocate absolutely ferociously for yourself, if you're like absolutely psychotic about it, because that's intense, so that's cool. But otherwise you have to make it seem effortless, right? Which is to say, or like classic kind of, like Richard III kind of, you whisper to somebody else, and then it'll be by acclamation, it's fine. But you can't, you can't. So basically, the idea is either the idea is, kind of, and maybe this is where we got our understanding. This is what we were modeling our understanding of primates on. But the idea is either you're like, you want it so bad and you finally got it, like a Britney Spears kind of model, which would have been really just about physical vigor, like or Lady Gaga even better, like you wanted it, you fought for it. So that's just physical strength. Alternately, it just kind of found you because you're magically, divinely awesome, right? Which would be kind of an aristocratic, like you were innately deserving.
Right.
But you can't. But the kind of push and pull of like, again in a room, like who's seen to be too thirsty, or the way the way really washed up, really like triply washed up, kind of former celebrities. Generally their last their last tragedy will almost always be read as a desperate bid for attention. Just to say, there's something very cruel in how we do this, because we want clear status reads, but we also really want to punish people for behaving as though they wanted too much.
Right. It's like cool in that respect, or celebrity too.
It is cool. I mean, basically, but.
I think all of that, to me, draws a line between two different, at least two, if not 27, different ways of ascribing and assigning these ranks or these hierarchies or this sense of status or some privileged position within society. And I think if you were to use the same way of dissecting the sports world, I'm sure, I don't pay that much attention to sports, but I'm sure there are issues of people who want it too much and we don't like their personalities. But at the end of the day, if you run faster than everyone else, you win.
Right.
As long as you didn't cheat and do other things like that. And so it's about physical capacity that is not subjective, hopefully not subjectively viewed. If you run faster than everyone else in the race, you are the winner, you get the hat, and you are given the status of fastest runner. Whereas...
But you may not get the endorsements, interestingly.
Right.
I mean, to bring in that.
But so within context, exactly. And so when we shift into a different context, the arts is almost by definition subjective. And so the fact that Van Gogh was not appreciated in his lifetime and now is appreciated, the paintings didn't change. So to some degree, the way we measure things didn't change. It's just the fashion changed, the appreciation changed. And so that's where I think that when status can be assigned, if status can be assigned simply based on the subjective will of the crowds, then that status is by definition tenuous and will shift the minute you say something we don't like. You no longer have that status.
But it also makes those situations kind of ripe for exploitation, or just a million varieties of Me Tooing, because you can dangle. No one knows how to get status. I mean, there's people who have authority and they can confer it, but what it means is you can dangle all kinds of promises that you will be able to like impart some status after this or after that, and no one's to say. I mean, this is the Avital Ronell thing. This is in academia as well. It's there's just dangling, because it doesn't sit still, because it's not athletics. You're not Kawhi Leonard. You're not
which actually sort of circles back to what you were saying, but almost in the reverse direction, which is that I think as much as we've been talking about the individual's desire to achieve status, I think there's also a really strong desire to assign status or recognize status in others. And so it's sort of, as much as I want to achieve some high rank because I assume that will make me feel better and I'll be a better dancer and all the other things that come with that, there's also, I want the person in charge, and I want someone else to tell me how to dress, and I want someone else to tell me which music to listen to. And so in the same way that we're disappointed when we achieve a status, we also tend to be disappointed when someone else gets that status, and so we want someone else to get it the next time. And there's this constant shifting of I promise you all this, now you've put me in charge, and either I'm not delivering or I am delivering and you say you don't want it anymore, but at the end of the day, now we have to change. It's a constantly shifting set of targets, both for the individual, and that's what I think. To me, it just goes back to that status is an agreement. It's a recognition of expectations of behavior and actions, both on the part of the individual that we're focused on as the subject of the status, as well as the individuals interacting with that person. And I think that reality, I think, is hardwired into us. The mechanisms by which it's assigned and maintained, I think, are shifting and constantly shifting, which is why culturally and historically, what we see today and what we see 200 years from now or 200 years ago will look differently in terms of what the materials are, but the structure and the patterns will probably always be the same.
Several years ago, 3-4 years ago, MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, had this social network analysis picture, so to speak, that was done in the 1920s to 1930s, and who among the artistic world was connected with whom. That's what a social analysis network is all about, who relates with whom according to what question you ask and so forth. Right, smack in the middle of that social network analysis was who? Not Van Gogh, Picasso. And he was the most high status person in the artist world, you might argue, based on a social network analysis, which is somewhat independent of... Anyway, it was fascinating. Yeah. I bought a replica of it hanging on my wall in my office to remind me to network.
One of the people who couldn't be here today but would have liked to have been was a colleague of mine at Dartmouth who's a social psychologist, and she's done really, Talia Wheatley is her name, doing really interesting work on monitoring how groups interact in real time. So an example is a orientation kind of cocktail reception for entering Tuck Business School people, and you can watch and measure, and this, this kind of analysis, right? How much time, who's getting the most time, how quick the conversations are and whatnot, and this becomes a way in some level of measuring this highly fluctuating thing that we call status. I mean, as you both were speaking, I was thinking this, and David too, that it'd be really cool if you could have a stock market of status, right? And it would be constantly moving around, and you would drop 2 points today and go up 2 points tomorrow, and then eventually fall off the chart altogether. But that's what makes it so complex.
That is what
That,
I mean,
yeah.
there was an app that was.
Oh, really? Interesting.
They tried to launch it a few years ago where you could basically rate people on anything you wanted, and
Right.
the Chinese have certain like social media metrics like that
Interesting.
too, but the idea was you're basically creating a market for approval or a market for status, or
There's a Black Mirror episode
Yeah.
about this that's
Oh, really? Okay.
absolutely amazing. It's one of the, you agree, I think
Yeah.
it's one of the best ever.
Yeah.
Where everyone's constantly rating, I'll give you 3 stars, I'll give
you rate every single
3.5
interaction
stars.
that-
Oh, that's
And
perfect.
it's very
Okay,
well
Black Mirror, I
done.
gotta watch that.
Yeah. I'm hearing this idea that status sort of it's almost like a traffic controlling mechanism, and it kind of crystallizes from that in some way. Does that resonate with the rest of you?
It allows us, it facilitates human interaction, right?
Yeah, it's one of the many mechanisms by which, and I don't want to be repetitive, but I think there's within a socially interacting group, within any interacting group, there has to be a measure of predictability. And so for me to approach you, I need to be able to, on some level, weigh the probability that this is going to end poorly for one of us, and what the benefits are and things like that. And so I think without anything else to go on, we don't interact. And so that recognition of expectations and predictability is built into our social needs. I think one difference though is that, or one thing that I notice when we're talking about humans and talking about that sort of shifting stock of social status, is that it's so faith-based in that, I don't mean to be alluding to religion, meaning that it is founded in a belief that other people's opinions matter. Whereas if I am going to get behind the strongest chimp, as long as my ability to assess physical strength, then it doesn't matter what others think, I'm going to be backing the right chimp. Whereas if I want to be backing the person that's going to be in charge, it's less about that individual and more it is about what other people are doing. And Bitcoin is a great example. Bitcoin is a phenomenally invented, nonsensical idea that is now $1 billion industry. That if I say this is worth $1 billion, it doesn't matter that I say that. But if the rest of you say it, then suddenly there's some value to it. So in the same way that if somebody says, hey, I'm very interesting online, and then someone else says, you're right, and then 10 more people do it, suddenly we have, it sort of feeds on itself. But if people stop saying that, then it stops being of value.
I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but it'd be interesting to think about the differences that happen when you make the scalar move from actual human interaction, where status, as I say, clearly in a group evolutionary sense, would also confer value on people that did things of benefit to the group, whereas in a virtual network, it's not clear that you get things by assigning status to others, right? And that distorts in its own way. I don't know, David, maybe you have thoughts about that, but it's a different economy somewhat.
We haven't addressed this other, especially because we're everyone in the panel. I'm not actually on the panel. Remember, you're all white males. The idea of privilege, and I was going to raise the interesting observation that there are some cultures where the status really seems to be really baked into it. Like I'm thinking about the caste system in Hinduism. And I guess the way I would view it, not in the least bit being an expert on that area, but based a little bit on what everyone's saying here, my thinking is that that's a system that once it got into place, it was very much self-perpetuating. It sort of maintained its own structure, and maybe why it was so strict and precise, and how it's persisted for so long, right? Whereas the systems we're thinking about in our current culture are a lot more fluid and loose, may even be creating some anxiety because they are fluid and loose. But privilege is another example of how people who do, once they get into some position of power, work to maintain it. So I was just wondering if people have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. And again, this makes for the murkiness in some ways of discussion in the post-18th century, where we moved away in the West, broadly conceived, from that clearly stratified, legally stratified society. I mean, you mentioned privilege. I love to point out to my students that the root of privilege is privis lex, private law, and so you think of a classically a state-ordered, or not caste, but an ordered society like old regime France. Law was conferred by the crown to corporations, according to who they were, right? So as a noble, you had certain private laws, right? Right to go to a different court and to be exonerated from certain kinds of taxes and so on and so forth, in the same way that the milliners had as a core, a body, certain private laws. So privilege was all about distinct laws, right? Ostensibly, we hold to a view of the equality before the law and gotten rid of that kind of stratified society. And yet at the same time, I think because for reasons that we've started to talk about, I mean, there's no society, you can't, I think, what's the number? Something like 50. You get 50 people together and communal sharing goes out the window, and you get some kind of hierarchies. And they're good hierarchies and they're bad hierarchies, right? And the question is, are the hierarchies that are forming in 21st century America ones that we want, that we're conferring for good reasons, or ones that are more like the older kind that you're referring to, that are sedimented, that have kind of structural support and underpinnings? And I think it's a little bit of both. This is why no one wanted to come to the panel, right?
It's a lot to dive into. Well, I think your point, at least it touches on something I was thinking about, that if hierarchical organization is just some natural reality, it's going to happen, or at least it's likely to happen. And as you point out, it's very difficult to avoid. So even in times, please.
Interrupt you, Jeff.
Please
right there.
do, thank goodness. Who knows where I was going.
Apparently, the one universal about all organizations of all times and around the world is hierarchy.
Right. And that,
Period.
Right, which suggests it might not even just be a biological reality. It might even just be some sort of physical or mathematical reality. So it exists. And I think there's also a big issue where, again, semantics, when we talk about equality, when we talk about equality in society, I don't think anyone is suggesting that all individuals are the same. So equality and similarities are not the same. So we're really talking about equal access or equal treatment, as opposed to,
The equality
equal
of the
status, in that my condition of being a rapidly aging white male is different than someone else's condition of being a young Hispanic female. All of those things are relevant in some context, but that's not what we're talking about. Equality, about trying to avoid dissimilarities. Off topic, your point was that, to me, it suggests that if these hierarchies are some naturally occurring system, that there's going to be a hierarchy, there's going to be a ranking. But the mechanisms by which those hierarchies are maintained and the means by which one ascends to the higher ranks, those things are changing. Who sets them? And I would say it's probably pretty obvious that the people who set them are the people in charge. The untouchables were not saying, what's great about this caste system is that the Brahmas are up here and we should, the Brahmas were the one who were setting the caste system. And so in the same ways that at this point in modern American history, financial wealth is the holy grail of status. People who have lots of money are seen to be better than people who don't have lots of money, regardless of other qualities and characteristics. And that status is set by your friend in marketing, So your friend in marketing is trying to get me to buy things that I don't need.
And there's been ever increasing inequality in terms of
Right.
the economics of it.
Because if we actually got to a point where there was even something getting remotely close to true social equality in terms of access to resources or access to individuals or how we're treated or how we're seen, I think that would violate some really deeply profound drive within us. And so I think that's why it takes a lot of meditation and overshooting our internal drives to do that. But I think who sets it is the challenge, in that who sets what matters are the people that are thought to matter, and then it just sits in circles on itself.
Well, it seems to be diffuse, but unfortunately the system now seems to be driving itself toward this sort of financial inequality. There's also the problem that the people at the bottom, like the untouchables you mentioned, suffer health-wise,
Yeah.
right? The people at the lowest rung, the underclass, have more hypertension, diabetes, obesity, et cetera. And I think both the sense of injustice that the top 0.1% have so much of the money, and that the underclass are very ill, drives some policymakers to want to do something about it. And it's pretty challenging, because I think if we take anything from our conversation today, it's hard to say exactly, well, what is driving this, right? If we really had a great sense of it, we might be able to do a better job of trying to fix it. Right now, it's kind of been a little bit ham-fisted, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised this point about health, and I think this also holds in the primate kingdoms, right? That, to be on the bottom of a hierarchy ain't good for you. And Sapolsky is very strong on this, I think, and it's true in human societies as well. It's complicated, though. James, you're talking about setting the hierarchy, and I grant you that to some degree that happens, that the Brahmins, control the rules. But we go back to our point of departure, and Warner said that, that hierarchy, or rather status, is not something that we give ourselves. It's granted or it's conferred. And I would, bring Weber back into it and say, there is a distinction between status and wealth. I think that in our culture, status and wealth are closer together than they are in a lot of places, and that's problematic. But one can imagine, even today, one can imagine somebody of, like I said at the beginning, of immense wealth and power, but not a lot of status, not a lot of social approbation. And so I think maybe what it takes then, and what's so hard about this, is it takes not only good laws, right, or sort of redistribution, but a change of values, right? If we begin to value and reward and grant status to people who do other things besides accumulate fortunes and dubious means, that's a way to change as well. And maybe that's coming.
Right, and that's why it's contextual. I think is that if we make a general assumption that these hierarchies will exist and that there will be a ranking, whether sort of organically or externally, there will be some ranking in any context. What differs is what are those rankings based on?
Based upon.
And if they are based on some really simplistic, basic biological differences, then we're just looking at physical strength or speed or agility or things like that. In a much more complex technological society, then those things no longer become as important, and we look to other things. And I think that your point is exactly right, which is that whoever we are, I suppose that's all of us, so let's do something. We get to decide what matters. And if we as a society say that it's not money, and it's not stuff, and it's not all these sort of superficial adornments, but instead it's the degree to which you help others, it's the degree to which you are a contributing member of social justice reform, things like that. I think at the end of the day, from a purely objective point of view, we would see that the hierarchy would fall into place, and whoever is the most giving, the most generous, and the best social justice reform advocate will become the highest ranking individual, and the greedy bastard will be at the bottom. But that would require some mechanism by which there is a push for that to take place. And I think that's the challenge, is that at the moment, because society attributes status and rank and power and access to money or some elevated position in society, which tends to be relatively superficial. And I don't mean to say humans are terrible, but I just think we tend to lean towards whatever's easiest. Then to change that would require either a massive groundswell from the disenfranchised, so much so that it could actually overturn the status quo, or a decision based on those in power to say, you know what, let's shift this, and instead of liking people like me, we're going to like different types of people. And that seems difficult for a lot of people to do, to actually sacrifice their own self-interest or their own position to change what defines those positions.
Wow.
There's just to go back to the sort of commercial aspect of it and the marketing aspect of designing status systems. I wonder whether, earlier when you were talking about what comes around to being coolness, like being sufficiently or adequately nonchalant about your status helps. But then you went on to say, yes, but there are some people who are really obviously driven, and we give them credit, even though they seem to be striving too much. And anyway, I agree with everything you said, but I take from it that it's really quite a complex thing. I mean, it's not easy to say, well, that's a good thing and that's a bad thing. I'm reminded when Al Gore was made fun of, I think, on Saturday Night Live. This reminds me of that comment of yours. And apparently his handler said, Al, you got to be much cooler, look like you're more hip. And he went and did that, and everyone immediately picked up on it and said, you're just a big doofus. Now you're trying hard. You really lost status with us. Anyway, if there is this complexity to it, I'm afraid what's happening with the people who market or handle a lot of the people who are seeking status, politicians I'm thinking of in particular, the keywords and the things that they're told these track well are very simple. And I submit they're too simple. And things like knowing when someone is likely to kiss up and kick down, which is a really terrific phrase, capturing that someone's striving too hard and is really not a good, decent person, that sort of thing would be really useful to sort of highlight more than I think it is being highlighted now.
And of course, this starts at the earliest age, right? It starts with our children. And, so I remember, I love the story, I'll find a way into a book at some point, but I went to junior high in California in the 1970s. And the school was built on a hill, and there were 4 levels, and everyone had lockers on those 4 levels, and the top lockers and bottom levels. Well, there was a classic linear status hierarchy in that junior high like you've never seen, starting on D level and going to A level. And all the cool, popular sports people were on D level, top lockers, and then the grade below on the bottom locker. And then it went to C and all the way to A, where the people got beaten up and pushed around and whatnot. My point is that kids, and teens in particular, are brutal, right? And they value status often in the most crude way, right? Maybe that's not giving them enough credit. I think there are ways in which teens push back in creative ways, but there's a popular set, and that's often, and then that gets exploited in social media in the, as you say, the crudest ways, and then we create a whole society of people who are posturing for likes and dislikes in ways that may not be good for the society as a whole.
Should we open up? Yeah. Want to open up? If people have any questions,
This
we'd be happy
woman
to.
Here has been dying to say something for a long time. So
would you come up to the mic?
If you'd like to. I didn't
or
even
whoever
call you
wants
out,
to.
but you have a very expressive face.
Where were you in California in 1970?
Monterey.
Monterey.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was in Berkeley.
That's where I went to college. So good for
It
you.
was different when you got there.
Yeah, it was. But hey, there was a little Berkeley left. So
Was there a little left?
yeah.
Anyway, number one, I feel that the structure has to change in order for who has status and not. That's a very basic thing. And as far as what causes a revolution, do you know Chambers, who wrote Revolutionary Change? No, that was a while ago. But anyway, that was very good. And it takes a group of people that are so miserable, and they see someplace else where the miserable people are able to make a change, And that helps, like that's what happened in the 19th century in Europe. Then being cool, I think that was very interesting. And, people would say they act cool and everybody's going to come to them wondering what they have to give or what did you mean by that? And also, what did you mean by referring to Avatel, Brunel?
Oh, I meant, well, I guess what I was trying to,
Pardon me?
I guess what I was trying to say is that, it's sort of a, this is a side comment, but there was, there was a saying in among sex workers and pornographic stars in the 80s, when the porn industry, when a certain level of the porn industry really got started, and they would say the difference between us and the other Hollywood, meaning mainstream Hollywood, the difference between us and the other Hollywood is we don't have to fuck anyone to get a job. And what they were trying to say was that in porn, right? If you were reliable, if you showed up on time, if you were drug and alcohol free, you would always get work. Whereas in mainstream Hollywood, everything was based on these on these deferred promises and vague, the kind of vague, I'll advance your career if you do X, yada yada yada. Whereas the transactions were perfectly clear in the pornographic film industry. All you had to do was be a reliable employee, and it was fine. So the reason I'm bringing that up is that the way being a graduate student, or any kind of precarious faculty works in the U.S., right? Or the way being, for instance, the way being a sort of young employee, especially a young female employee, or in the art world or in the movie business. There's also the imbalances. What you have to do to get ahead is so unclear, and the metrics are so vague, and they're so wrapped up in cultural capital. So of being being the favorite graduate student. How much dry cleaning do I have to pick up for you? Even though that's technically not my job, nor should it be. If I want to get really good recommendations, when I go on the market. So
the answer is a lot.
So that's what I was basically these culture industries really operate off of a lot of promises and a lot of deferral.
And don't you feel that today we don't have a structure? It's just free for all in a way.
Where?
All over. Just all over. And as you suggested, Hollywood, and I was in Berkeley during the 60s when they integrated the schools, there was no structure, so all these cultures were thrown together, and nobody really knew how to behave. It was and I think that's what's happening today. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And I loved your referring to the pyramid of Maslow.
I'll just talk down to this.
We just found the real tallest man in the
no
room.
longer the tallest person in the room. That
No,
works
I think
out.
he is, right? I spent decades actually in the field of marketing.
Okay.
And I was struck by what Mr. Burke said, that there is a science to products and branding and all of that, but the really, and so therefore my own professional interest was in consumer choice. Why do people choose a product or anything that you can think of? All of that is conferred by the consumer. A brand doesn't have its own status. It varies by person. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't take this as cynical, but to a certain extent, it is a scheme, because branding science, marketing science is very, very advanced. And so I asked the question, why do people want to? We just walk right into it. You could call this a first world problem, but it probably isn't even that. Why do people want status? Why do they want prestige as it's exemplified in the physical thing? How you look, the watch you wear. Is it a fast car that you drive? I don't know, but my question is, how do we unbundle that, and how do you stop this in a caring world? It shouldn't be so important, but I don't really see a way to stop it.
I don't either. But what's interesting about what you're bringing up is the world of the future for psychology is neuroscience. So in other words, what happens that makes me feel emotionally somewhat differently, and if it's got sugar in it, I'm going to really feel great. But that feeling then is what I want to repeat.
Right.
And that creates the cycle. So the more that you can create that, the better, so to speak, in terms of it. So.
But there's always a really interesting, I mean, this moment feels a little bit like, like the late 60s relative to brands and products, which is to say you have these really lovely, because it tracks with the marketing tracks with technology, right? And there are these moments, the technology creates its own new evaluators of status, so when you look at big corporations, trying, like stumbling in like amazing and hilarious ways trying to do Twitter, where like the brands just wind up discrediting themselves by again seeming too eager to please and too thirsty, and
right.
you wind up with these little like a moment where you can reset the hierarchies, even if you can't actually undo hierarchy per se, but where like they just can't read the situation properly. And
what's interesting about what you bring up is what has just occurred in MSNBC. I'm sure nobody in this room watches that channel, but I do.
Is there any other?
The Donnie Deutsch show on Saturday night now is applying what you're an expert in to politics. I don't know if it's ever been done quite that way before. So I think there's going to be some interesting learning that can come from that, at least. I hope there will be. It better be, or I'm not going to watch it. So.
He's a very smart guy.
Very smart guy.
With lots of experience in that, and it does apply to that, to politics. It really does.
Yeah. It's a little worrisome, by the way, but...
Something you said that was worrisome in terms of neuroscience, and I don't know anything about neuroscience, but my understanding is that we're getting closer and closer, and at the moment we're mapping, but we still don't know what a thought is. We know that neurons fire.
Right. We're not beyond the mapping
get there.
yet. We'll get there.
We'll get there, and my concern is that I don't see, and I don't mean to be cynical, because I think human history is full of extraordinary examples of humans doing extraordinarily positive, good things. I would say on balance, though, when we look across the trajectory of human history, I would say we're much more inclined towards, shall we say, unjust things or unpleasant things or marginalizing or oppressing, because that tends to be the easier way to do it. And my concern...
So you've read *Sapiens* also, huh?
Sorry?
You've read the book *Sapiens* as well,
I
huh?
haven't read it. I'm supposed to read it. I'll read it next time.
Get with it.
But sorry, I want to let you have your question, but the point that I would make is that I think as we go forward, as we learn more about how the human brain works, I don't think that necessarily is going to, it will provide the opportunity to do all sorts of things. My concern is that it will also provide the opportunity to manipulate, more so than other. And I don't mean to keep picking on marketing, but I'm sure we're marketing lots of good things, but on balance, the economy is built on my buying things that I don't need. And if I have a choice between two things, the marketers are going to try to convince me to buy one thing over the other, and that's what it's all about, as opposed to saying, anyway, sorry, please.
Thank you for a very provocative discussion. First of all, a disclaimer. And I particularly thought about this yesterday while we were celebrating this tragedy on the beach in France. I grew up in Germany under Hitler in the 1930s, and I had a fantasy that if women were running the world, maybe we wouldn't go into these terrible wars. Well, the last 60 years have tested that hypothesis, and I'm not sure that it stands up. But especially in non-human primates, there's some evidence that testosterone levels and ranking in their leadership hierarchy makes a great deal of difference. Apparently that is not true in females. Apparently, female hormones don't correlate at all. What is your reaction to that, and what does it presage for the future?
So there's a lot of parts of that to respond to. I don't look at hormonal levels in the work that I do, but I'm familiar with some of the research, and absolutely right, in baboons and a couple of other species where it's been tested, there is a clear correlation between testosterone in male rankings when you look at higher. I should add that there are plenty of species in which there really isn't a good metric for ranking males because groups are unimale. So if there's only one male in the group, he doesn't have a rank. He doesn't have a relative position to other males. There's only a dichotomous, there's basically you're in charge of the group or you're not. And whereas in a lot of mixed male groups or multi-male groups, we see this sort of somewhat linear hierarchy from top to bottom. And in those species where it's been examined absolutely correctly, that there is a correlation in that testosterone levels track. The question, which is interesting, and a couple of people have raised it, is that it might not be the direction we think, in that it made sense at first that, high levels of testosterone, which are associated with aggression and, for want of a better term, confidence and willingness to escalate and things like that, would predispose an individual to rising in the ranks. But it actually seems to possibly go the other direction, in that as rank increases, testosterone increases. And so my limited understanding is that the directionality is not necessarily clear, but there's definitely an association. Female mammals also produce testosterone, but they produce much, much smaller levels. It's associated with the same things as it is in males and sex drive and things like that. But other hormones tend, in biologically female individuals, tend to drive the same sort of thing. So cortisol sort of takes up some of the slack for testosterone in biologically female individuals. So it gets complicated. And your other point, which I lost track of somewhere along the way.
Matriarchy also. Yeah.
In matriarchal groups rather than patriarchal groups or male-dominated groups. And we can take it outside of primates then, and we look at the female-bonded groups in things like elephants. Have very clear matrilineal hierarchies, and those hierarchies are respected behaviorally. You see who gets to drink water first, who leads the group outside of things, and who communicates with whom. But the level of physical aggression is lower, and suggesting that, and I think that's the thing. If we're looking for hope for the human species, which it sounds like many of us are, which is a weirdly cynical thing, because to say we hope for the best suggests that we think it's actually unlikely, or at least we are up against some odds. But I think that when we look for models to look for, because that's the great thing about being human. We might be equipped with some horribly incomplete set of genes and gray matter, but we have the capacity to mimic things and pretend to be certain things. I think one of the only sort of cogent ideas that came out of all this for me was that we recognize that this might be a natural propensity towards these hierarchies and this oppressive marginalization structure, but we have the capacity to want to do something different. And that's the hard work. We recognize that some egalitarian society where we all pick flowers and share one another's food is really, really goes against so many of our basic internal drives. But we have the capacity to do it. And how can we do that? And I think looking for a framework and a way of defining that. So I think looking at matrilineal species and how they do it, because it's not to say that aggression and violence isn't part of that, but it's much more based on cooperative behavior, and the risk is the same. So in some cases, if I violate the norms of hierarchy currently, I risk physical pain, and that's going to be my motivation. But equally so, even if there's no risk of physical pain, if I risk rejection from the group, I lose all the benefits from the group, and that's a massively important component to my own survival. And so I think shifting our whole definition of status, our whole way that status is achieved. It might be achieved by more cooperative, sort of beneficial structures instead of violent or aggressive ones.
And I think it's important to, to go back to this point that status is culturally configured, and so it does change, right? There is hope. One can change what is valued and what is not. And, there are enough people in this room who've lived long enough on the earth to know that that happens quite dramatically in the space of a generation or two. So, I take some hope in that. But at the same time, I go back to your point, James, and and Warner made it too, that, the nexus between psychology and marketing goes back to the early 20th century, and trying to figure out how people feel and what makes them feel good or happy, work on happiness in another hat. It's a long quest, and we're getting closer and closer to figuring that out. And I think that should really worry us, because it's not just about marketing, it is about politics too, right? And clearly that's all that line has been obliterated. And that opens up all kinds of difficult questions, but maybe that'll be the next session, right?
Thank you. Maybe we should put in a grant to get blood levels at the White House.
That's all right. You write it. I'll sign it.
I have a way we can get the blood from them too, by the way. Well, I think that, unless there are any other questions, I want to thank all the panelists for a really stimulating conversation. I think you also all came out really pretty even, so thanks again. That was great.